welcome to Convocation today. We are pleased to welcome Dr. Sarah Franklin to the Convocation stage here at Snow College. Dr. Sarah Franklin is an associate professor of cardiovascular medicine at the University of Utah with a research laboratory in the Nora, Eccles, Harrison Cardiovascular Research and Training Institute. She received her PhD from Brigham Young University and then received postdoctoral training at UCLA in the Department of Anesthesiology. Dr. Franklin is also an assistant director with the Rural and Underserved Utah Training Experience in the School of Medicine. There, she oversees the summer research experiences for undergraduate and medical students and teaches the Research and Innovation course over the summer. Dr. Franklin is passionate about exposing young individuals to new career paths in medicine and science, creating meaningful educational opportunities for students, and mentoring them along their academic journey. Dr. Franklin is also the founder and executive director of Hope Humanitarian, whose mission is to serve the world's most vulnerable populations with an emphasis on refugees and orphans. They work in 10 different countries around the world and support people struggling through 4 of the top 5 international refugee migrations. All of this from someone who grew up on a cattle ranch in rural Utah. Please welcome to the Convocation stage, Dr. Sarah Franklin.
Good afternoon. I am excited to be here. It's so fun to drive down here this morning and just really excited to share some of my experiences with you. That was a wonderful introduction, and I wanted to share a little bit more about me. I love learning about people, and so as mentioned, I grew up on a sheep and cattle ranch in Carbon County, so basically straight east from where we're at. My childhood was full of family and animals and hard work. I love horses. I had horses growing up, and I have horses now. We also had a lot of other animals on the farm. This is one of the years we raised pigs, and this was my prize-winning pig when I was younger. I come from a large family. There's 7 children. This was a family photo. Obviously, when I was younger, we've expanded quite rapidly, and there's 5 of the 7 siblings are married, and 18 grandkids are part of the larger family, and just have a wonderful family that I grew up in. As was mentioned, one of my passions from an early age was science. I loved science, and I knew that that was what I wanted to do and pursue as a part of a career. And so I majored in biochemistry. I have a PhD in biochemistry, and I'm currently at the University of Utah, where I love working. My lab studies the heart. We do research primarily on heart failure, and these are some of the individuals that I've had the privilege to work with in my lab over the years. As was mentioned, I also just really love interacting with students and trainees at all levels, and just have really enjoyed this part of my life. So that's a little bit about me. I want to know a little bit about you. Who here has traveled outside of the United States? Do you mind putting your hand up? Great, so there's a decent number. If we were to pretend that Canada and Mexico didn't count, could you then raise your hand if you've traveled outside of the United States other than Canada or Mexico? Okay, still a good crew here. That's fantastic. I love that. So I wanted to share a little bit of statistics with you. If we were to look at the average number of countries that an American adult has traveled to in their life, we can look here at the United States. It's actually about 3.5, so this figure rounds up to 4. So the average American has traveled to about 4 countries outside of the United States. You know, that is only 2% of the world. On the spectrum, we're actually on the lower end of how many people actually travel outside of the United States. If we think about another statistic, and we look only at the demographic between 25 and 34-year-olds, some of the most traveled individuals in this age range come from the UAE, the UK, Australia. But what about those that have never traveled? So on the right side, sorry, the left side up here, the US shows that in this demographic, 31%, or almost a third of individuals have never traveled outside of the US. Now, if we just consider all Americans, that drops down to about 29%, but still pretty close. But again, almost 1/3 of Americans have never traveled outside of the United States. If we think about what are some of the most popular destinations that individuals travel to, you could guess that Canada and Mexico are the top two on this list. But I would argue that probably Canada doesn't feel like that much of a different country. Some of the other ones you can see are shown here. One of the things that caught my attention is that, these are some really exciting places, but it might not be the most adventurous, or what I would consider adventurous places to travel. But I want to tell you about my first real international trip, and I refer to it as real because it's beyond Canada and Mexico. The first time I traveled internationally was when I was 25. The first place I ever went to was South Korea. I went to Seoul to participate in a research conference, and I loved being there. It was so wonderful to experience a new culture, to meet people, to really experience another part of this world. Now, when I arrived in Seoul in 2007, it was a different world and a different time than it is now. And to kind of illustrate that to you, I want to think back on the history of the cell phone. So you can see that obviously the cell phone or the mobile phone was developed in the 80s. It used to be this big clunky thing. You can see that the screens on these are really small because we used to pretty much not be able to do anything on our phones except call each other, so we didn't need a big screen. In 2002, the BlackBerry came out, and everybody thought that was the coolest thing around. And if we fast forward to 2007, that's actually the year the first smartphone came out. But I was still thinking the BlackBerry was the coolest thing on the planet. And so that's what I had, was a BlackBerry. So when I traveled to Seoul, I had a BlackBerry, but I didn't take it with me because a few things to point out. Back then, in 2007, we didn't have Google Maps. Most people did not have smartphones. There was nothing like Google Translate available then. And for the most part, your phones didn't work in other countries, so it was pointless to even take it there. I did have a calling card. Have you guys ever heard of a calling card? I thought that, I had this calling card. You could use a phone and type in a number, and then you could make international calls. And I did take a calling card with me, but I got to Korea and found out my calling card didn't work internationally. So it was totally fine. I still had a wonderful time in Seoul. It was the capital, especially when you fly into the airport. They've been really good at listing a lot of the signs in English, so it wasn't too difficult for me to get around. I had 2 colleagues that I was traveling with as well, and so we had a wonderful time at the research conference and exploring the city. But the last couple of days, we decided to travel to the very east coast of South Korea, and we wanted to check out a more rural part of the country, and we actually went to a place called Sokcho. So this is me and one of my friends, Michael Zhang, in Sokcho, South Korea. And what we realized when we got there is no one spoke English. There wasn't a single sign or direction that was in English as well. But we were still able to get around, visited one of their national parks, and just really had a wonderful time. But there was definitely some challenges. I didn't have a cell phone, wanted to make sure that my family knew I was fine and safe. And when I was in Seoul, I could just use the internet and I could send an email to my family. So when I got to Sokcho, I was really interested in trying to find an internet cafe. If you haven't ever heard of an internet cafe, back in 2007, you could go to a little cafe because the hostel we were staying at didn't have Wi-Fi. It wasn't common for hotels or places that you stayed to just have internet available. So you have to find an internet cafe, a specific area that you could go. They would have computers. You could log on and send an email. What was so interesting at that time is that I went to the front desk of the hostel I was staying in, and I was trying to communicate with the guy to find an internet cafe, and I'd started throwing out words like internet. Where can I find internet? And he just looked at me, kind of shook his head, didn't know what I was talking about, started trying to think of other ways that I could describe to him what I was looking for. Asked him if he knew where there was Wi-Fi or Wi-Fi, because sometimes some countries will call it Wi-Fi, or Wi-Fi or internet. And we went through this for about 15 minutes, and he still was shaking his head, but I was so impressed with the fact that he never got frustrated with me. He never asked me to go away. He never gave up on me and said, I just can't help you. He continued to try and communicate with me, and this was part of my journey in realizing that there's so much you can communicate with people when you don't speak the same language. And I paused for a minute, I grabbed a piece of paper and a pencil, and I wrote www. And his face lit up, and he started smiling and shaking his head, and he grabbed a map of the area, and he put a big X on it and handed it to me. So I took that, walked through the door, and was hoping that if I walked down the street to the place on the map, I would find an internet cafe, and indeed I did. And it was just one of the times in my life, the first time in my life, I really got to experience another culture and really see the beauty of other people and recognize how many good people exist in this world. I made it home safely, had a wonderful experience. I kind of want to shift gears here a little bit. We're going to come back to international travel, but I want to ask you a few more questions. I want you to pause with me for a minute, and I want you to think about what has been the darkest time in your life. What has been the most challenging time in your life? For some people, maybe you had a really challenging time a couple of years ago, and maybe you're going through a really challenging time now. Maybe you've had a couple of really challenging times. Maybe this was financially. Maybe this was depression. Maybe it's just something that you were struggling with really personally or overwhelmed in your life. If we fast forward several years past South Korea, there is one point in my life that was one of the most challenging times in my life. So what helped you during these moments? What were things that you did? Were there people that impacted your life? Were there people that helped you through those days? I often think back and remember that some of the smallest kindnesses made the biggest difference to me. At that time, I came across this quote that said, if you want to lift yourself up, lift up someone else. And even though I was struggling and going through a hard time, I decided I'm going to start volunteering at the Road Home shelter. I was living in Salt Lake, and the homeless shelter downtown is the largest shelter is called the Road Home. It has a women's section, a men's section, and a family section. And I started volunteering there once a week. I would go in the mornings for an hour or two before I had to go to work, and I quickly learned that I loved volunteering at the front desk. And I loved volunteering at the front desk because the kids that would stay there with their families, they would stay in their own little room, very plain, small, we would refer to it as a closet. They came to the front desk in the mornings, and they would come and pick up their bowl and spoon, and I loved being there, and I loved seeing the kids every day. It was one of the beautiful times in my life that I was able to experience the breadth of individuals that were living in my own community. I started trying to make a habit of trying to get these kids to smile or laugh during the mornings when I interacted with them, and I found that as I left there every day, I was usually smiling. The other thing that I realized that was so impactful at this time in my life was I realized that as hard as I might be having, or the hardest experience I might be experiencing at that moment, there are people who would love to have my bad days. There is someone out there, they might be sitting in the same row as you, they might be someone you've never met, but sometimes there are people out there that would give everything for your worst day. It's an interesting thing, perspective, I know that that might not always be the most comforting thing for somebody else to tell you, well, somebody else has it worse than you. Sometimes, that's not what you want to hear. But for me at that time, it really helped my perspective. I've included a picture up here to illustrate a point. If you look at this image, what do you see? What's the first thing that pops out to you? Do you see a vase or a cup? Do you see two people looking at each other? What's the perspective that you're seeing? Because they both coexist, but sometimes, unless someone points it out, you see something first, and that's what you focus on, and that's what you believe the images of. The interesting thing about perspective is that two different people can look at the very same image and see completely different things. They can see something different. They can also value something different. Two people can look at the same life and say, I hate my life. It's such an awful life. This isn't a life worth living. And another person can look at that life and say, I would give anything to have that life. Different perspectives on the exact same thing. Different values assigned to the exact same thing. This is also a moment in my life that I realized that my perspective can be influenced incredibly by what I'm choosing. And if I am choosing gratitude, and if I'm choosing to instead say, this isn't going right, and I wish I had this, and why can't, I have that? But if I choose instead to think, how blessed am I, and what is the goodness that I have in my life, it can change my whole perspective. At this same time in my life, I had actually always been involved or interested in global humanitarian work. I remember when I was 16 and I asked my mom, a mailer came to our house, and in the mail on this piece of paper was an opportunity to go volunteer in Romania. And so when I was 16, I asked my mom, can I go and volunteer in Romania in an orphanage? And her response was, absolutely not. My mother had never been out of the country at that point. And so it wasn't until I was in my 20s I actually got involved in humanitarian work. I was able to work with a number of really wonderful organizations. I traveled to Peru and helped build a school in a poor village in the Andes. I traveled to Rwanda and Uganda, where we volunteered with schools. We helped build a well to get clean water to a community and support communities by establishing piggeries. And so in 2015, when another refugee crisis happened, it caught my attention. This map actually shows the migration routes for Syrian refugees in 2015. Syria is about the middle of this country, or on the middle of this image, and the thickness of the lines represents how many individuals migrated on those routes. So over 4 million individuals fled from Syria because of war, bombings, instability, and not being safe. You can see that the thickest line travels from Syria up to Turkey, through Turkey, and then to these 4 little dots on the side. Those are 4 small islands in Greece. This is where the majority of those refugees were traveling. Often they would travel to Greece and then continue to travel up into different European countries. This caught the attention, the international attention in 2015 and into 2016. Beginning in 2015, there was over 3,000 people arriving every day on these tiny Greek islands. Now, these Greek islands are really close to Turkey. This is actually me standing on the north shore of Lesbos, the very top island of those 4 little green dots. And as you can see, you peer behind me, and about 3 miles away, you can see the coast of Turkey. So it's not very far. This is where the refugees would travel, and they would actually travel by boat. Well, these numbers continued to increase to a point where there were over 10,000 people arriving every day on these Greek islands. 10,000 people a day. As I mentioned, they would travel, they would pay to be transported on these rubber rafts. This was almost always happening at night because it was illegal, but they were fleeing for their lives. And oftentimes, they would overcrowd these boats. And one of the stories that caught my attention, as well as the international community, was the story of a small boy, a 2-year-old boy named Alan Kurdi. His family had tried to apply for asylum 3 different times, and their paperwork was denied every time for a couple of reasons. Asylum paperwork was not originally printed in Arabic, and if you made one mistake, your paperwork was sent back to you to redo. Alan and his family, with his mom and his dad, they boarded a boat in the middle of the night, and about halfway across that 3-mile channel, their boat sank. And most of these individuals can't swim. And that night, Alan died, even though his mother and his father were both rescued the next day. And this next image is actually an image of an aid worker. Alan's body washed up on the north shore of Lesbos 2 days later. I wanted to volunteer in Lesbos. I wanted to try and help, and I tried for months. It was really hard for me to find an organization at the time that I could volunteer with, especially given some of my limitations in that I could only volunteer for a week or 2. I couldn't spend 6 months doing it. But I really wanted to volunteer, and I eventually found a way to do that. And so at the beginning of 2016, I traveled to Lesbos, and I volunteered for a week on that island as the refugees were pouring into that country. It was the first time I'd ever seen such poverty. But this work called to my heart and became very passionate about it. So after returning back from working with refugees in Greece, I wanted to start a humanitarian organization. I wanted to give other people the opportunity or try to support people in their interest in traveling internationally, experiencing other cultures, meeting other people, learning about the other large percent of the world that most of Americans never see. And so I started Hope Humanitarian in 2016. And as was mentioned, our mission is to serve some of the most vulnerable populations around the world through humanitarian efforts with a big emphasis on refugees and orphans. And we have a really wonderful team that has grown over the years. There's a number of our core team in this picture, along with a lot of volunteers that work with us. And we've been very excited and very fortunate to be able to travel around the world helping people. But back in 2016, I started the organization and immediately turned around a couple months later and took individuals with me back to Greece to continue to volunteer in the refugee camps. And I met a lot of really wonderful people. One of the things that you'll notice in these photos is there's a lot of oranges. These individuals were not allowed to work. They lived in these very primitive tents. They had food rations that almost never included fresh fruit or vegetables, except that, especially in Greece, where oranges are so abundant, they were able to have 1 orange a day, usually. And because that was such a special thing that they had, they would save them. And if you were working in that camp that week, they would save them in the hopes that they would be able to see you and give you their most special thing that they had, their orange. You could see this family I visited one day pulled out these bowls, and they were so excited because they had been saving all of their oranges in the hopes that I would stop by their camp, or their tent. Fast forward 7 years, and we work in a number of different countries. More recently, Poland and Moldova, Turkey, Lebanon, Bangladesh, Uganda, Colombia, the Dominican Republic, and Belize. Now, why do we work in some of these countries? Well, the top refugee hosting countries include Turkey, Colombia, Uganda, and Lebanon. Each of these house over 1.5 million refugees, with Turkey estimated to have now exceeded 4 million refugees. It's a lot of individuals. So this is where we're currently working, but if we jump back to 2016, we loved working in Greece, but we could quickly see that our effort could be well placed in other countries, including that of Turkey. And so we traveled to Turkey, and one of the things I do want to mention is all of these photos were taken by either myself or a couple of wonderful photographers that volunteer with our organization. None of these are clip arts. They are my own experiences. This is actually a refugee camp in southern Turkey where we have continued to work for the last 6 years. We've interacted with a number of families, a number of individuals, and each of the projects that we work with in the countries is different and is often based on what the needs of the camps and the needs of the people in those situations are. As you can imagine, food is often very scarce in most, if not all, of these situations, and so we try to supplement or provide some type of food aid to these individuals. You can see that these individuals are waiting or currently picking up food from the trucks that we've brought into the camp. You can see again in this photo the individuals that are very eager and excited to pick up their food. Throughout every country, I won't be able to tell you about all of these countries, but I'm going to give you a brief snippet of a few of the countries we've been able to work in and some of the work we've been involved in. There are children everywhere. We've also been able to provide some type of medical aid to different areas. This is actually this small boy that you can see in the image is baby Tamir. He didn't have access to medical care when he was born, and during the first year of his life, he became paralyzed on the right side of his body and is paralyzed still to this day. We have teams that have traveled to Uganda and worked in the Chakatu refugee camp that houses over 130,000 refugees. Most of these have fled from the Congo, where there's a lot of violence occurring. In these camps, we often have a big gaggle of kids that follow us around everywhere we go. They're always smiling and love to interact with you. One of the things that I have always been so grateful for was that early on in my travels I learned that you do not need to speak the same language to be able to communicate. There are so many ways that we can interact and understand each other even if you don't know the same language. We've had groups that have traveled to Belize that have worked with orphanages, worked on projects to improve the orphanages and the sustainability of the orphanages, also worked with local poor communities. Most recently, this last year, we helped expand a school so that they could have a preschool and a kindergarten, because most of the kids that would come to school for first grade, they would be so behind that they didn't know how to read, they didn't know their letters. Had some really wonderful experiences in Belize. We've also had groups that have traveled to Colombia and worked near the Colombian-Venezuelan border as thousands or millions of Venezuelan refugees have fled that country. A lot of our humanitarian efforts here have centered on medical care, and it's been incredible to see some of the people that have walked into our clinics. One of the most impactful experiences was when a mother came into our clinic holding a 10-day-old baby that she had given birth to in a field on the side of the road as she was walking from Venezuela to Colombia. She was so concerned that her small child be able to see a doctor. She kept saying, my baby's brand new. I need my baby to be able to see a doctor. That we didn't realize until she'd been in our clinic half an hour that she had a broken arm, a completely broken arm. You could actually, when we finally noticed it and got her to talk to us about it, she was a mother like any mother in this world that's more concerned about their child than themselves. Her bone was almost protruding out of her skin. Every once in a while, we're able to do something special for individual people. This young man in the middle here, he's paralyzed. His brother, who's also sitting next to me, carried him on his back for days from Venezuela to Colombia. And we had the unique opportunity to be able to buy him a wheelchair so that he had additional mobility. In Bangladesh, the small structures that the families live in, they're made out of bamboo and often covered with some type of tarp. They are right next to each other. You almost can't tell them apart from one family to another, and they extend in every direction as far as your eye can see for miles. It's estimated to be almost 1 million individuals in one small area that used to be a national park in Bangladesh. Again, there's so many kids and they follow us all over. We were trying to take a group photo, and you can see our group in the background, but in the foreground you can see all the wonderful children that love to follow us around, love to help us. If they could hold our hand while we were stepping over a ditch, you'd have 3 or 4 little kids hold out their hands all at the same time because they wanted to be helpful, because they were so grateful that you were there trying to help them. Again, in most of these communities, healthcare or access to some type of healthcare is often non-existent. This little child, her name's Roki Mahatu. I met her when she was less than a month old for the first time, and her mother was very scared that she was going to die, and she said, I don't have the strength to walk the 3 miles to the medical center because I know if I walk there, I might wait in line all day and still never be able to see a doctor, and I would have to walk back. And so we were able to get some medicine for them and bring them back to her and her other children. We've had a wonderful experience being able to build some schools, dig some wells, develop a sewing center there in the refugee camps, and hopefully provide a little bit of aid to the wonderful people that are living there. Over the years, I've had the opportunity to travel to 35 countries. I have a little list in my office that I keep. It's been really fun to kind of check those off. And as I've traveled to so many countries, some of the questions that I've gotten are, Sarah, what have you seen? What have you experienced? What are some of the things that you've learned? And so I'm going to share just a few of the things that have really touched my life. Some of the things that I have been so impressed with is that there is so much goodness in this world. There is more goodness than you will ever know in every country in this world. The people are so kind. They're patient. I told you examples of people that I've struggled to communicate with over the years, that they don't give up. They don't walk away. They, even when I get frustrated, they try to keep getting me to talk to them and try to communicate and figure out what it is that I need. Their generosity. I used to think that I was generous. But then I realized I give of my excess. When I'm all taken care of and I have a little extra, that's what I give. These people, they give in their scarcity. When they barely have enough for themselves, they will still save that precious little orange because it is the best gift that they have that they can give to you. And I've experienced that time and again. Their resiliency is amazing. And really, my travels have been a testament to the fact that we are all part of the human race, and the humanity of people transcends borders and peoples and cultures. To build on that, one of the things that I have loved experiencing is that we are more alike than we are different. This father was living in the Inofita refugee camp, and he really wanted to just take care of his son and have like a rocker and a comfortable, safe space that he could rock his child and that he could comfortably sleep. And so he found this old used crate and some rope, and he actually rigged this up in his tent so that his son could actually rock him to sleep. This mother, after doing her laundry and hanging it outside her tent, is feeding her child. It's just a mother like any other, doing the laundry and feeding her children. This is Tamim and Zarina are the 2 individuals in the middle. They were grateful that we were there. Our group of volunteers was there, and I hope you can see that we're actually in their tent. They wanted to have us over for dinner, right? It's such a common thing around the world, having friends over for dinner. Except for them, it required a lot more planning. They had to borrow utensils from their neighbors. They had to borrow plates from their neighbors. They had to borrow rice from their neighbors so that they could feed us, but that is what they wanted to do. And Zarina spent all day cooking over a fire so that they could have us over for dinner, and we could share it, an experience together in their tent, in their camp. These next 2 photos are some of the most impactful photos to me. I want you to stare at these photos. I want you to look at the detail. Can you see the mud? There are times of the year in Turkey that it's impossible to skate the mud. There's mud on the child's feet in the foreground. There's mud on the woman's feet who's sitting on the tarp, rolling out dough. It's just two women making bread together, two women sharing the preparations of making a meal for their families. They're rolling out this dough to make flatbread. And they're smiling. They're talking and they're smiling, and they allowed us to experience this moment with them. They're resilient and ingenious. They took bricks, turned them on their side, built a fire, and put a metal, what looked like a big metal bowl, it was actually just something they found in nearby field, over the fire and cooked their flatbread on this little setup. But it got the job done. Again, we are more similar than we are different. Children everywhere are children. They have so much energy. They love to play, and bubbles are loved by children no matter where you are in this world. That is something we have learned that we need to always take with us. A few other things that I've learned that have impacted my life is that no act of kindness, no matter how small, is ever wasted. One of the things that comes to mind is there's a professional magician named Mike Hamilton, and he has volunteered with our group for years. He's a wonderful man, and as we started doing some of this work, we decided to work with Mike. He would come to the refugee camps, and we would put on magic shows. Originally, we thought these, the kids will love these, right? What we didn't realize or expect is that the adults would love them just as much, and that sometimes we would have a magic show where everyone in the camp would want to come. This is Mike and his table, his floating table. This is another refugee camp in Turkey. This is Mike. Sometimes we've had, a more decent area for him to do a magic show. This is where Mike is actually performing his magic out of the back of a van, because that's what we had. We were in a rural part of Turkey. He's basically using the back of his van for some of his props, and has some little girls that are participating. What you can't see is the large audience on the other side where most of the camp had come out to see. And you can see in these images the kids laughing, the kids smiling. And one of the things that I will never forget is one day after a magic show, a man came up and through a translator said to Mike as I was standing next to him, "Thank you so much for helping me smile today. I haven't smiled in days. I've had some unfortunate information about my asylum paperwork. I have been having a rough go, and I'm just so grateful for you, and I'm so grateful that you helped me smile today." Sometimes it is the small things. There's times that you might be thinking, or you might be thinking now, like, that's wonderful, Sarah, but I just don't have the ability right now to travel in my life. I don't know when I will be able to. It's a hard season in my life, or I just don't have the financial ability to travel, or I have family obligations and it's not a part of my life. One of the things that I love that my friend Holly Richardson introduced me to is a phrase: you can cross the ocean or you can cross the street. You will find need anywhere, in our own communities. And don't let the fact that maybe you can't travel right now stop you, because you can cross the ocean, but you can just cross the street too. And along those lines, I love this quote: even if you think you can't do much, you start by doing what you can with what you have where you are at. You might just find that you can make a world of difference in somebody else's life. So if I was to summarize some of the things that I've learned, some of the things that I was hoping to share with you today, is that I hope you can travel. I hope you make that a priority in your life. There is nothing that can replace experiencing other cultures, meeting other people, learning about the world that we are a part of and how similar we really are. That your perspective can change anything, can almost change everything, depending on what you choose to focus on. If you pause to try and look at it from a different angle and incorporate gratitude to really influence that perspective. And as I mentioned previously, I know it's not always the most helpful piece of advice or what you want to hear, but if you sit with it for a moment and think and remember that there's someone out there that would love to have your bad day. In fact, they would love to have your worst day. They would give anything for your worst day. But that sometimes when you're in your darkest moments, if you look outside yourself, it has the magical ability to lift you. And as I mentioned, no act of kindness is ever wasted. I still remember the face of a woman whose name I do not know. One of the darkest days of my life, she smiled at me, and it changed my whole day. No act of kindness is ever wasted. And there's so much good in the world. I hope I've helped you maybe think a little bit differently about some of these countries that I've traveled to. And just to end, we are more alike than we are different. We're mothers and fathers, sisters and brothers, friends. And if we pause and sometimes take a minute, break down our lives, we are so much more alike than we are different. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm so excited to be here. Please let me know if you have any questions. I'd love to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. We do have about 5 minutes for questions. Who has a question that they'd like to ask? Please wait for the microphone to get you as well.
So you said you're from Carbon County. I'm from Emory County. So how did you change that? How did you go from living in a small town to broadening your perspective and traveling the world?
Thanks. That's a wonderful question. You know, I think sometimes it's easy to think like this is where I'm from, and this is what I know, and you know that big wide world can seem daunting. It can seem scary, and I think sometimes you just have to just say that you're going to do it. And you're gonna run into challenges. I have traveled by myself sometimes. I have been in a car accident in Costa Rica. I've gotten lost in the streets of South Korea. I have had a flat tire in the middle of nowhere, Turkey. And every time, there's been the kindest people that have stopped and helped me. I've always been surprised by that. Initially surprised, and now I just know that that's actually the world that we live in. It might not seem that way when you turn on the news, but it really is. And it's because we often, don't always just, what news channel have you ever looked at that just shows all the good? There's some out there. You have to look for them. But, even if it seems scary or daunting, start somewhere. Just start. And, now I travel all the time. It never phases me, but I guarantee you in 2007 when I was traveling to the other side of the world where I knew I wasn't going to be able to understand anything, that some of those days I was going to be by myself, it was daunting. But it was also really fun. Anybody else? One of the things I did, I remember Cheryl had asked me, is if you're more interested in some of the work we do with Hope Humanitarian, you can follow us on social media, on Facebook and Instagram. We love to help facilitate people traveling. We've got a lot of people that have traveled with us that have never been out of the country and never done humanitarian work, and those are my favorite. Come with us.
So how do you find places to volunteer at?
Yeah, that's a great question. Some of our efforts have specifically focused on some of the areas of the world that we feel like have the greatest need. I really love to try and focus on where there's great need, where there are people that are suffering, And like I was mentioning in that graph, we have focused on some of the world's largest refugee populations because they are also usually overwhelmed. So the countries, you can imagine a country taking in 4 million refugees. How does that even work? How do they have houses or tents, and how do you even just take care of that? And oftentimes those countries are very overwhelmed. And so that's a big part of it. Sometimes different projects will, we will just kind of stumble in or meet someone and have some really wonderful projects. We've actually, I was mentioning, we have a collaboration with Utah Tech University where we actually take a group of their students every year to do a humanitarian project. We've done some projects that are a little closer in Belize or the Dominican Republic for them because of the limited time that they'll have maybe during a fall break or a spring break, and they've been able to fit really well with those time frames, and so just really wonderful opportunities there. It's kind of a little bit of a mix.
Okay, what is your best advice for those who've never been on a humanitarian trip and might be a little scared?
Yeah, it's scary, right? Considering most of the Americans have only ever experienced like 2% of the world, it can seem daunting. I remember I had this flight credit that I needed to use in like a couple of months, and I was like asking my sister, like, basically with this flight credit, go almost anywhere in the world, where should I go? And I was like, should I go to Europe? And she was like, no, have you seen Taken? Okay. And then I was like, well, should I go to Africa? And she's like, no, you'll probably die, and they won't have clean water, and you'll get really sick, and you'll never make it home. And it was just funny because every country I said, what about this, what about that? She had some like response. Have you seen this movie? What about, getting some crazy disease? Well, it can seem daunting. I've been there. But I promise you the rewards of going far outweigh any of the scared that you might be experiencing. I really think that one of the best ways to do it initially is to go with a group. Go with a group. There's, we do humanitarian work. There's a lot of other really amazing groups out there doing humanitarian work as well. Start with somewhere that you're familiar with. It is one of the reasons why we've continued to have projects in Belize and the Dominican Republic. I say those words to you and you're like, a lot of people are like, okay, I could start there. I say Bangladesh, Lebanon to you and you're like, no, right? It sounds scary, and I get that. And so start with somewhere that you're familiar with. Work with an organization that you can get some information from that'll help you through that process. And I tell you, I love what I call first-timers because, just last year we took a woman, never been out of the country, never been on a humanitarian trip, to Uganda to work in this refugee camp in rural Uganda with 130,000 refugees, and then we did a little safari in Kenya afterwards. And we know that they usually require a little more work. We walk them through the process of, do you have your passport? Do you need a visa? And I think sometimes that's really a great thing to do because you're traveling together, you're traveling as a group. They can help you and make sure you know all the steps in the process that you might need to take.
We're out of time. If any of you would like to come down and speak with Dr. Franklin, please feel free to do so. But great questions. Thank you so much. But let's give her another hand and thank her for coming today.
Thank you.